You're listening to Data Center Therapy. Please take a number, and an engineer will be right with you. Good day, everybody, and welcome back to Data Center Therapy, a podcast by Ivoxy Consulting. I am your host, Matt Yeti, a Senior Solutions Architect with Ivoxy. If you haven't listened to previous episodes of Data Center Therapy, just a little bit about myself. I've been at Ivoxy for nearly 6 years. I am rooted in all things data center. I would say the shallowest in networking, right? We have a dedicated networking team at Ivoxy, but I focus on systems, storage, layer 2 networking, security, data protection, security, a little bit of security as well. And that data protection is really what we're going to be talking about today. And we are really genuinely blessed to have Rebecca Fitzhugh from Rubrik on the line with us today. And Rebecca is the principal technologist for Rubrik. So she's got an awful lot to say about the product and technology and the direction that it and the industry is moving. So Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Absolutely. Would you mind going into a little bit of a CV about yourself, if you wouldn't mind?
Oh my goodness. Is this an interview? I thought this
On
was a
the
podcast.
spot.
Yeah.
Boom.
So I've been in the industry for about 14 years now, and I actually started my career in the military. I served 5 years in the Marine Corps, and kind of became like the full stack, if you will, engineer during that time because we were not super specialized, right? There at any point in time, somebody could walk up with a box, set it on my desk, and be like, "This is a net app. Go figure it out." I'm like, definitely cut my teeth there, running a very large data center. And then after I got out of the military, I spent about 6 years consulting, and that led me to my role at Rubrik. So I'm the principal technologist at Rubrik. So what that kind of means is I spend a lot of time in the field with our customers, and I take a lot of the feedback and kind of understand what they're doing, and I bring that back to product and engineering, and then I work very closely with product and engineering to hopefully make some cool stuff reality.
Well, what I'll say is, not to dive too deep into it at this point, but being one, I would say I read the title Principal Technologist, and I think you are a nerd advocate, which might be the coolest position in the industry, if you ask me.
Yeah, I think so. So it's fun because I get to kind of advocate for technologies that I'm passionate about, or different methodologies that I'm passionate about. But then I also get to advocate really for the customer, and kind of be that voice for them. I always kind of say that I'm the translator, right? I'm translating kind of the marketing and the technical and all the things that are happening within Rubrik over to the customer, and then get their feedback and hear really their perspective and understand their challenges and what they're trying to accomplish and bring that back.
So what you're saying is you're a people person. I deal with the people. Office Space callback there?
Yeah, nice.
Anybody?
It's funny, I would never actually call myself a people person. I'm like, please, leave me alone in a dark office, but it comes with the job.
Well, I want to follow up on the backside of that by saying I feel, and I've seen your impact, even though I haven't been present for your meetings with customers, because I have found Rubrik to be one of the more responsive companies when it comes to the development of their products and listening to the actual needs of the customers on the ground, right? We've all been victim to companies that have grown and are established and mature, and sometimes the dev cycle is so slow where you have to wait till next release next year or the year after, or it's vaporware. It never happens. I have seen specific customers ask for specific, this is impacting my environment, I would like to be able to do X. And a handful of months down the road, X comes out, whether it's in a general release or specifically to the customer, and then later for a general release. So I got to say, I'm really impressed with how that workflow goes, and it helps me to just get even more enthusiastic about the product because I know that my customers are going to be listened to.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I feel like it's easy to kind of get bogged down sometimes in the things you couldn't make happen, and so it's good to hear the wins.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so to move on to really what we want to talk about today, and it's kind of been at least under the covers, or if not, just rising to the surface, the current of data center therapy right now is really wrapped around automation, cloud, and all of this. These are new technologies or it's a re-veneered old technology in a new way, but really under the covers is what we're going to be talking about today, and that is APIs, right? And it's a three-letter acronym that everybody out there in IT has heard. They may have good opinions about it, they may roll their eyes about it, but ultimately the reality is under the covers, APIs are really what drive a lot of the not only operation of a single technology product, but the interaction between multiple vendors, multiple products. So let's just go right down to it. I know you're deep into this, Rebecca. What is an API?
I mean, honestly, you just defined it, right? So it's definitely that kind of mechanism, or that set of rules that allow you, as like kind of the end user, to interact with sort of the back end of an application. And generally speaking, the use case for that is to make more than one application, more than one component interact with each other, right?
Right, right. And when you think API and an application programming interface, it's just a fancy way to say, like you said, how you interact with a product, the back end typically. And now you're seeing a lot of that surface to the front end in a lot of ways, right?
Absolutely, right. I think more and more companies are, because they're really focusing more on extensibility, which I think is a very, very good thing. It's it's bringing that to the forefront, not only of their product, but also to the mind of the customer.
Right. And well, when I think API, of course, I think REST. It seems to be one of the biggest and the most pervasive in the industry. But like I know you had mentioned Facebook developed GraphQL. What is the difference here? Do I care as a customer?
Well, I mean, the first thing I care about is like, is there even an API, right? And then like that's question number one. And then kind of getting into the more of the specifics of the architecture itself. So I agree with you. I definitely think when we first started hearing about APIs 10, 12 years ago, it was more of like soap, right? And
Right.
I would say rest in peace, but like just let it go away. And then we that kind of brought on REST, and there's a lot of like benefits of REST, but and we start looking at GraphQL, like you mentioned, it was developed by Facebook, and one of the things like good or for bad, Facebook has a ton of data, and so when you make an API call using REST, generally speaking, it returns all that information back, and so it was a kind of difficult, if you will, to make your GET requests more efficient. So you would sort of get the whole payload returned to you. And when you start thinking about the amount of data that companies like Facebook are managing, that's really inefficient. And so the biggest advantage that I see for GraphQL is that ability to take a very complex query and add some more parameters, more properties around it to get and return only the data that you need. And because you're able to really kind of delineate and specify more granularity around that request, that makes also the response time and processing of that call way faster.
I mean, absolutely. And everything seeming to push towards cloud or at least include cloud. And I don't know if it's certainly not forgotten, but it's not hot in the tip of everybody's tongue. But mobile is still a very big thing. And cell networks and quotas and caps and bandwidth and things like that. And as data grows, can't you can't parse that entire result set. You have to have that done on the server side and only what you want handed down to the client.
Absolutely, right. And I think what we're really seeing GraphQL get adopted the most by right now is like that web, like you mentioned, like the web kind of side of things. So SaaS platforms, especially the newer SaaS platforms, they're really kind of leaping into GraphQL before the rest of us.
Hmm. So, from a Rubrik tune standpoint, what is Rubrik's approach to the API?
So API first, right? API first for basically everything. So we actually, when you look at, because we have kind of two products right now, right? We've got Cloud Data Management, and then we have Polaris, right? And they work very much together. And when you look at Cloud Data Management, our original sort of product, it very much was built API first, and it was less about, to be honest, the customer at that point. It was, we want to build something, right? But we also want to be able to consume our own something, right? And so that became, how do we do that? And it was very much like, okay, we need to use RESTful APIs, and we need to build out the API architecture first, right? And actually understand what those endpoints are first, and then we'll write our actual software on top of that. So we are our own biggest API consumer for cloud data management.
I mean, that's huge because we've seen, again, mature products, and I'm not knocking any product that could fall under this platform, this category that before this push for APIs or at least customer facing application programming interfaces that you could reach out to, Before that, a lot of times you see the mature product and then they release an API or a library to talk, and it always, almost always comes with this is the subset of functions you can now run against that. They have to build that in after the fact, and you say, I just want to do this that I can right now do through the GUI and click a click and I can do it. Can I do that? Well, that's not in this version of the API. That's why I think to your point, it's key that everything you can do in the interface when you interact with the product is based upon its API. So anything you can click on, you can also script or reach via whatever method you want to access that API. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and I think you brought up a great point. I certainly get very frustrated with some data center products because I go, I really want to automate this thing, but that endpoint's not available. And then I'm like, well, we have it, and that's really kind of unrealistic expectation because our company, it's 5 years old. REST APIs were a thing 5 years ago, but some of the software that I'm using was not. It's much older than that, and so then you accrue this massive amount of functionality and feature set, and then having to go and expose all of those endpoints because realistically speaking, there's APIs. They're just not available to you. So for them to go through and document that and publish those APIs, that is a huge amount of technical debt for a software company that's older. And so it's going to be a slower role for them. And that's definitely a big challenge. And that's something that I face right when I'm consuming their products.
You just said a magic word, documentation. It might make everybody out there listening groan right now because I remember when I interviewed with Ivoxy, and one of the questions they asked me was, how strong are you at documentation? And it's, you want to give an affirmative answer and you want to be honest about it. And that might be in conflict for a lot of people. But documentation for APIs is absolutely paramount because I want to go ahead and I want to program a script for using this rubric, and I want to automate the recovery of my VMs. If without documentation, I am completely in the dark. So I mean, it's incredibly important. How do you tackle documenting and staying up to date because you're not resting on your laurels with the software updates. So with every single software rev that you release changes the API or at least can or add more functionality. How do you stay on top of that and communicate what those APIs are and how to leverage them successfully without having to learn Mandarin, Chinese, or any number of different languages to kind of parse through the doc?
I'll be honest with you, it's extraordinarily difficult. I think documentation is, like you mentioned, like the most important thing, but it's also one of the hardest things to do well. So that's where it's like really nice that you've got companies like, Redox, Swagger, and so on that make it a lot easier for software companies to effectively generate that documentation. So we can kind of go in there and scrape, if you will, sort of the metadata of all of those API endpoints and plug that information into things like Swagger and generate the documentation automatically. And then we'll go through and kind of clean it up, make sure everything looks right, feels right. And I think the biggest value that you can provide when it comes to API documentation is not just listing the endpoints and parameters and things like that, but also really giving you that pseudo code or those code snippets. And one of the things that we honestly don't do that I'm really advocating for internally is more code snippets with different languages. I think for me, the gold standard when you look at API documentation is Stripe, which that's not a company in our space at all, but you look at what they're doing, you go, wow, I can not only look at the documentation, I can see the curl, command. I see like a sample JSON, that it's getting returned. But then they go through and they can say, oh, do you want to use Golang? Do you want to use PowerShell? Do you want to use Python? Like, here's exactly how it makes it so much simpler for you and takes a lot of the guesswork out of it.
I think that's extraordinarily important, like you said. I wrote a script recently for a customer where we automated disaster recovery and then tested it and leveraged JSON files for input for the script to basically make it a modular script where you say, I want to recover this VM and this VM and this VM, and I leveraged PowerShell for that. But ultimately, under the covers, every single library, like you said, Go language or whichever you choose, Python, it all ends up as a curl request or basically an HTTP call, correct? And that's nice because you've got a baseline where whether you want to use PowerShell or Go or Python or whichever, it all boils down to basically a URL call or a post or a get on an HTTP endpoint. So when you mentioned Swagger, can you do me the favor, honestly, me the favor? I know a little bit about it, but anybody else who might be listening, they probably even know more than I do. Can you explain a little bit more about what Swagger is when you brought that up?
Sure. So Swagger is it kind of gets into there's so many things that Swagger honestly can do. Um, when you look at it, it's like not only can you actually like kind of build the APIs and provide a lot of that information per language, it also helps you design it, right? And kind of model what the API should look like based off of specific standards. But it also provides not only that documentation that helps with that kind of development experience, but you also can make it interactive, and that's what I think is really important. Is I mean, unless let's be honest, we've all tested things in prod, right? We all definitely like test, and especially
No.
no, we all definitely quote unquote don't test automation in prod, but we do, right? And we break stuff. So one of the other things that Swagger can provide for you is effectively that simple functionality of just testing your APIs without actually affecting the software, right? So it kind of gives you, if you will, some dummy API endpoints that will return certain statuses based off of the call that you make and the different parameters that you set. So really,
That's been my experience, is the sandbox, the playground, so to
yes,
speak. I really do enjoy that I can, it says, okay, hey, I need this endpoint, and what function am I calling against, and what bit of data do I want? Click, run, execute, and it gives it back to me without me having to write a script or generate anything or dare touch prod, like your point. So I that's my experience with Swagger, and that piece I very much like.
absolutely. And on the other kind of flip side of that, like on the vendor side, this is a really easy and nice way for me to work with you to develop a solution without actually giving you a bunch of my software, right? I can just make that playground available to you, right? If it's online, which a lot of companies do that.
Yeah, it's absolutely a benefit, and I do like how, I mean, I've used it before, and I've worked with many of your colleagues, and one of the things that I also like in developing my script was, hey, open Chrome, open the developer tools, and look at the inspector, and you can actually see the API calls being made by the web interface when you click on live mounting of VM's current snapshot or whatever. The fact is, you can actually look at what the API calls are being made and then drag those into your own project if you're looking to automate that from a script-based level.
So it's not just me. I also basically steal the exact same. I'm like, I'll run the exact, I do exactly the same thing, and I'll go, oh, I didn't think about doing it in that order. Interesting. And I'll kind of steal exactly what's happening under the hood for whatever I'm writing on the side.
Yeah, it took me a while because I wasn't used to it being available so easily like that. So, oh yeah, just look at the inspector, just look at the inspector, and finally it got through to me. And now you don't have to play the guess game where how is this being accomplished on the back end? Are they using a private API that's not available to me, the customer? And when all of that is removed, because I mean, let's face it, I mean, a Win32 app has public APIs, maybe, but certainly has private APIs that are called, and are those available? Can or am I going to have to write an app that basically simulates a mouse to click over on this pixel to do this at this moment? We've come a long way to kind of from a black box to a really translucent experience when developing product integration for stuff that never used to talk to each other with any kind of, certainly no kind of support.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest values I think that APIs really bring to the table is that just that obvious transparency, like kind of how is it working? Like it may not understand like the technical bits and bytes under the hood, but you can really understand at least the framework and the order in which certain operations are happening.
All right, so I got a question here. Let's go full practical mode because I'm like a pragmatic devil's advocate, I guess, for lack of a better term. Kind of like who benefits, cui bono. I am Joe Smith. I'm not a programmer, okay? I'm not a programmer. I'm a sysadmin, I'm a sysengineer, whatever. But I want to automate this. Do I have to learn a programming language to do this? Are there pre-built scripts that are well documented that I can kind of modify and integrate in my environment? Or am I just completely lost until I go for 6 months training and learn how to script in JavaScript or whatever?
I like that you're playing the devil's advocate, but you just like set me up so perfectly to talk about something that I love.
I swear I didn't do it on purpose. Everybody listening, that was not even on the bullet list of stuff we want to talk about.
No,
So
it wasn't at all. And so when you said that, I was like, oh, perfect, beautiful. So yeah, I think that's such an important thing, and that's something that I have advocated for so long within Rubrik is because I experienced that not only with Rubrik itself, but like as I'm working with other applications, right? Like I have a huge lab environment for my team and I want to automate a lot of tasks and I'll go, I wish I had a sample, or like, I wish like I really am interested in learning this new automation tool or this new language, but I don't even know how to get started. Sometimes, or coming up, I always feel like coming up with the use case is the hardest. Like actually writing the code's easier, at least for me. I feel like no imagination. So, what we actually launched with Rubrik specifically about 2 months ago was something called Rubrik Build. And so we're kind of calling it this open source community. And it's open source in that we have a bunch of software development kits, integrations, but also use cases that are freely available to you. And you can contribute back, right? But it is kind of that exactly what you just said of here's a cut and dry script, right? Or hey, you're interested in doing that? Cool. We actually have already pre-built that. And you can look at it and go, oh, well, it's in Python. I want to do it in PowerShell. But you can at least see that framework and understand what it needs to look like and then translate that over to your language of choice. And all of it's documented. There's quick start guides, like all the things that I find are really important. Like I've really been stressing with this particular program.
Yeah, well, that's important. The documentation, the explanation, and for me, everybody learns in a different way. But I am a learn by example, and that's kind of my devil's advocate point. Is that all of the theory and the concept is all exciting and is promising, yes. But why would I want to use this? Where am I going to benefit from this? And if that's, and when you tell me that and say, this is Matt, this is how you might want to use it, and this is why it makes your life easier and better, and you tell me that, my eyes open wide. And so when you go to the fact that you have an example use case and an example script showing you how to do it, I can break that apart. I mean, I started with Pascal. I moved on to PHP. PHP is still my web scripting language of choice. I know Python is the hot, really where things have moved, but I didn't go to a class or learn PHP from a book. I mean, I've used books, but it has been, let's be honest, everybody out there who scripted, you ripped it off and you made your own version of it, and that's how you learned. So I do like that the use case is already out there by example, showing you this is why you'd want to do this, and this is how you do it.
Absolutely, and that's I I think I agree with the sentiment of I kind of learned how to write code by stealing other people's code. And it's but that's why we're doing this is like we really want our customers and our partners to be able to look out there and be like, oh, that's how I do it. Just take it. Change IP address to yours. Done. And then if you figure out a way to make it better or improve it, or you update it to the next version or whatever before we do, great. Like submit a pull request and we'll merge it in. Like once we do a bunch of testing and code validation. So it's the goal is that it becomes a two-way street. We're creating these and publishing them for you, but then also you're taking them and making them better and then contributing that back.
So in my script development, in the aforementioned DR automation script, and I leverage PowerShell, and I found the API documentation to be very good. Let me ask you this. With every version that Rubrik releases an update, is it simply, hey, check out the documentation and stay up to date? Or is there a summary, a digestible, hey, this is what's changed? Or our API, I imagine I know the answer to this already, but are APIs frozen and it's only an additive, or are things potentially deprecated? They change. Is there a way to digest? Is my script going to work against 5.0 when it worked against 4.1? Is there something in place to deal with those questions?
That's a very long question. So I'm going to give you honestly the very much like the enterprise architect answer, where it depends, but I'm going to kind of explain the kind of the general rule of thumb. For the most part, once it becomes a part of like a versioned API, it mostly doesn't change, right? That's kind of the point, right? That it's a stable API for you to use. Now, that resource that's defined and those endpoints, like more functionality will get added as it expands, right? So before you might go in and say like cluster, and you could only see a couple of different endpoints and a couple of different options for you. Then obviously, like as some new functionality comes out, that will get added in. And a lot of times, what will happen is, we've got basically the V1 of our API, and then we also have internal. If you go and you look at internal, like there's potentially a lot more functionality that's there, and it might, to be honest, it might change, and that's why it's internal. These are things that we're testing. These are new things that we're working on. Use at your own risk. But once it becomes versioned, it's pretty stable outside of new functionality that gets added with additional releases of our software.
I'd say it's a good answer, fair answer. And it, of course, always falls back on our favorite. It depends. But yeah, and that's just me being a little even more devil's advocate. I personally like if things change to have that digestible and announced. And I feel like, especially with the build site, that's the kind of information that's easy to surface should a change happen down the road.
I'm with you 100%. It's 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 actually on my, like, if you will, like my honey-do list for Rubrik Builder. I'm like, because I was like, they, it's not that they drastically change, but as we add new functionality with new releases, it's like we want that to be something that our customers can easily digest. And so I've been exploring different ways that we can, kind of surface that. I feel like Slack does a really good job of that. Like they have, I think it's like a monthly newsletter that they send to their quote unquote like developer program. So anybody consuming Slack APIs, where they go, hey, here's what changed and here's what's coming in the next release, and it's like, ooh, you kind of look at that and you go, that's really interesting. Like, how can we do something similar, but like more specific to our space and our product, where it's more transparency to the customer, and that's certainly something that I want that we're not doing yet. We're not. We obviously update the documentation and we make those changes, but surfacing that information more easily to our customers is still something that we're figuring out how to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I also find the dialogue and the willingness to listen and act upon customer feedback is so paramount. How many companies have we talked to in our entire lives? You call your internet service provider at home. Are they listening to you? Do you really feel like you're being heard? And I've reached out to some Rubrik employees directly and said this. Your doc's got this error, this there, and it's fixed. Like that's it. It gets fixed. So I do like the willingness to listen and that's what encourages me about a technology going forward is this company so drunk on their own Kool-Aid that whatever they say is perfect and anything to the contrary is just kind of discarded, and that's not the case from what my experience has been. And that's really good to hear from your end as well.
I mean, I'm definitely biased, but I've been working more closely with like our technical, we call it our tech pubs team, right? But effectively the team that works on the documentation, and wow, they have a hard job. Like start, but I'm also just
Sure.
like just so impressed every time I talk to them. We're like, oh yeah, here's how we're doing this, and here's we want to make, for example, one of the initiatives we're working on right now is like, how do we make it even easier to get our documentation, right? Not just tie it to the service portal, but like actually surfacing it in other ways. And so they're exploring a lot of ways to just improve documentation. Besides just having this, large PDF file that you can only get by logging into your support account, right? So it's definitely something that we take very seriously, our documentation, and it's because nothing I think ruins. We've all been like, ooh, this sounds like a really amazing application. Like I want to use it, and you go and you download the docs, and either A, the docs don't exist, or B, like they're garbage town, and you can't really figure out how to use it or get started. Nothing kills like adoption faster than that.
Well, absolutely. And I'd like to wrap up this entire topic, this conversation, with one of the points that we kind of touched on in a previous conversation, but how the API economy affects everybody, right? We're talking about third-party integrations, like you're saying, and documentation goes towards that. The ease in which your product communicates with products that really, whether company B's product sells 1 or 1 billion, it doesn't affect your bottom line at all necessarily, but the fact that you can work with that company's product is so important to your direct customers. So how important is the API to the greater economy in the industry?
Honestly, I think it's paramount. I think it's becoming more and more like more and more critical as we move forward. With technology, but and I think the kind of point that I'd like to make is so many people are using APIs and not even necessarily realizing it, right? Like a lot of times we'll download some pre-built plugin and then install it and like voila, now I can, for example, monitor Rubrik in Splunk, right? But it's like you're actually consuming Rubrik APIs by doing that. And I think we don't always make that connection. We just go, oh, I have this pre-built thing, this pre-built integration. But it's everybody has that same desire, right? I want to have, self-service automated provisioning, or like I really want to have one monitoring tool that monitors everything. And I don't think it matters, whether it's an enterprise type customer or if it's something like federal, like all these different segments and verticals. I think we're all have kind of the same kind of core desires. And I think it all ties back to that API economy of making them readily available and easily consumable. And if that's something that you decide you want to go and learn a programming language and or use an automation tool to consume it directly, or if you want to consume more of something like a pre-built integration or plugin, it doesn't matter. You're still consuming and becoming a part of that API economy.
And I think the most important part of that is, let's say Rubrik or Splunk doesn't bring it and say, and there is no integration. There's not that pre-built plugin that you can install. You can write it yourself. I think that's
Absolutely.
the important part. Yeah, that's it. That's the magic right there.
Yep. And that's where when I talk to different customers and partners, they go, hey, you've got this PowerShell module, and I noticed that's missing this. No joke. This was one of the best kind of stories that's happened really recently. We had this brand new customer, like they just got Rubrik, and they started using our PowerShell module, and they go, huh, I noticed it's missing something. It's missing this function that I wanted to have. And they kind of filed an issue in GitHub, and they said it's missing this, and we kind of had this little interaction where we went, would you be interested in actually writing that function? Would you be interested in like contributing back to the module that you are consuming? And they were like, I don't know how. And we went, well, what do you not know how to do? And they go, well, I can write a function, but we noticed that you're using test-driven development, and I don't necessarily know how to write the test. And we went, oh, okay, well, we'll help you with that. And so we kind of sat down and walked through like this what function they wanted to write, how to write a test for that, and then now they're a PowerShell module contributor, and they're a brand new customer, and we were just like, yes, this is what we're talking about right there. Is if it's not there, like, you can build it, or at least highlight like, hey, I have this use case and it's not being met, and then when we have the development time, we can absolutely add that for you.
That's a successful story right there. That's the kind of stuff that it must, like you said, principal technologist, that kind of stuff, that story must really psych you up, Rebecca.
I can't even tell you. Because I literally like looked them up, and I was like, man, they literally just bought our software, and they're already just like consuming our APIs and like, being an active contributor with Rubrik Build. And I was like, yes, this is exactly what I'm trying to accomplish.
And that kind of experience and that paradigm shift of getting your hands dirty, getting under the covers with the software, with the product you're using, that extends to the rest of the data center, because every company now is kind of following that lead of exposing, doing their best, either if they weren't API from the ground up in the first place, or they're backporting and working to expose almost all of their functions via API. It's the way it's going, where instead of having to somehow hope somebody sells this expensive integration that does this one function between these two or three or more products, you have the tools now to do it yourself. And that's, I think, outside of any pre-built module, the power to do it yourself is really an empowering function for a lot of the people in the trenches in IT.
Yeah, and it's like I think kind of like the nerd equivalent of like jumping out of an airplane is sort of that, like, at least like the API automation nerd equivalent is when you submit that pull request, and then a couple of days later they go through a code review, and then the code that you wrote gets merged into something else. You're like, holy crap, like I just contributed to that. Like, I helped build that product or that platform or that tool or whatever it is. And you're like, that is badass.
I love how nerd is no longer, and it's not for a long time, a derogatory term. I remember it was such an insult for so long, and in high school, everybody made fun of me for being a computer geek, and now they all want to be my friend on Facebook. That's the way I wrap that up. How ironic is that?
And Facebook invented GraphQL. Now we've gone full
right.
circle.
Yeah, you all are nerds now too, looking at your iPhones. How'd that work out?
Exactly.
Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time out of your, I'm sure, very busy day to join us. This has been extremely enlightening and very entertaining from our side of things.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks again. And anybody, if you're still listening, you're going to be happy you are. If you're interested in learning more about how Rubrik might be able to help your organization, we have a special opportunity just for our listeners here on the podcast. We will bring alongside a free gaming console of your choice. We're talking Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, or PS4, PlayStation, to anyone in the Pacific Northwest who books a consultation with us. And when I say us, I mean a meeting with Rubrik and Ivoxy. For details, go to our episode blog page at ivoxy.com/Rubrik, and that's RUBRIK, ivoxy.com/Rubrik. We're giving away these to the first 5 consultations we set, so be sure to reach out to us as soon as possible at ivoxy.com/Rubrik. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to yet another episode of Data Center Therapy. If you have questions, topics you want to hear us rap about, people you want to hear us bring on, companies you want to talk about, technologies, etc., reach out to us at podcast@ivoxy.com or go to ivoxy.com and click the contact link and fill out the form, and we'll reach right out to you. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Data Center Therapy. I'm your host, Matt Getty. Have a great day.